Chapter 1. On the pleasant shore of the French Riviera, about halfway between Marseille and the Italian border, stands a large, proud, rosy-colored hotel. Palms cool its flushed facade, and before it stretches a short dazzling beach. Lately it has become a summer resort of notable and fashionable people. A decade ago it was almost deserted after its English clientele went north in April. Now, many bungalows are near it, but when this story begins only a dozen old villas rotted like water lilies among the pines between Gosse's Hotel des Etrangers and Cannes, 5 miles away. A mile from the sea is an isolated railroad stop, where one June morning in 1925 a woman and her daughter arrived and went down to Gosse's hotel. The mother's face was of a fading prettiness. However, one's eye moved on quickly to her daughter, who had magic in her pink cheeks lit to a lovely flame. Her fine forehead sloped gently up to where her hair burst into waves of ash blonde and gold. Her eyes were bright, big, clear, wet, and shining. Her body was on the last edge of childhood. She was almost 18, but the dew was still on her. The mother said, "Something tells me we're not going to like this place." "I want to go home anyhow," the girl answered. "We'll stay 3 days and then go home. I'll wire right away for steamer tickets." At the hotel the girl made the reservation in idiomatic French, like something remembered. When they got the room on the ground floor she walked through the French windows and out a few steps onto the stone veranda that ran around the hotel. When she walked she carried herself like a ballet dancer. 50 yards away the Mediterranean yielded up its pigments, moment by moment, to the brutal sunshine. Of all the region only the beach stirred with activity. 3 British nannies sat knitting. Closer to the sea a dozen persons were sitting under striped umbrellas, while their dozen children pursued fish in water or lay naked in the sun. Rosemary came onto the beach, took off her bathrobe and dashed into the sea. She floated face down for a few yards and finding it shallow walked forward. When it was about breast high, she looked back toward shore. A bald man with a hairy chest and a monocle and a pair of tights was looking at her attentively. As Rosemary saw it, the man poured himself a glass of something from a bottle in his hand. Rosemary laid her face on the water and swam to the raft. Reaching it she was out of breath, but a tanned woman with very white teeth looked down at her, and Rosemary, suddenly realizing the wideness of her own body, turned on her back and swam toward shore. The hairy man holding the bottle spoke to her as she came out with a slow Oxford drawl. "You're a fine swimmer." Rosemary looked for a place to sit. Obviously each family possessed a strip of sand immediately in front of its umbrella. Besides there was much visiting and talking, the atmosphere of a community which did not welcome a stranger. Farther up sat a group with bodies as white as her own. They all lay under small hand parasols instead of beach umbrellas and had obviously spent less time at the place. Between the dark people and the light, Rosemary found room and spread out her peignoir on the sand. Lying so, she first heard their voices. A white-haired woman in full evening dress, obviously worn since the previous evening, with a tiara on her head was saying something in a shrill scornful voice. Rosemary, feeling a vague antipathy to her and her companions, turned away. Nearest her, on the other side, a young woman lay under a roof of umbrellas making out a list of things from a book open on the sand. She had a string of creamy pearls round her neck. Her face was hard and lovely. Her eyes met Rosemary's but did not see her. Beyond her was a fine man in a jockey cap and red tights, then the woman Rosemary had seen on the raft, then a man with a long face and a golden, leonine head, with blue tights and no hat, talking very seriously to a young man in black tights. She thought they were mostly Americans, but something made them unlike the Americans she had known before. The man of the monocle and bottle spoke suddenly out of the sky above Rosemary. "My name is Campion. Here is a lady who says she saw you in Sorrento last week and knows who you are and would so like to meet you." Looking around with annoyance, Rosemary saw the untanned people were waiting. She got up and went over to them. "Mrs. Abrams, Mrs. McCusco, Mr. McCusco, Mr. Dumfrey. We know who you are," spoke up the woman in evening dress. "You're Rosemary Hoyt and I recognized you in Sorrento and asked the hotel clerk and we all think you're perfectly marvelous and we want to know why you're not back in America making another marvelous moving picture." The woman continued, "We wanted to warn you about getting burned the first day." Rosemary looked at them all uncomfortably. Mrs. McCusco, a pretty young woman with an intensive manner, Mr. Dumfrey, a young man, stout Mrs. Abrams, wishing her mother had come down here with her. She did not like these people, especially in comparison with those who had interested her at the other end of the beach. Her mother's social gift got them out of unwelcome situations swiftly and firmly. But Rosemary has been a celebrity for only 6 months, and sometimes the French manners of her early childhood and the democratic manners of America made a certain confusion and let her in just such uncomfortable situations. Mr. McCusco, freckly-andred man of 30, turned to Rosemary and demanded aggressively, "Been here long?" "Only a day." "Oh. Going to stay all summer?" asked Mrs. McCusco. Without waiting for an answer, Mr. McCusco got up to go in the water, followed by his wife, and Rosemary followed, too. "Shall we go to the raft?" Mr. McCusco asked. The man with the leonine head lay stretched out upon the raft and he greeted them as they reached it. He had one of the saddest faces Rosemary had ever seen, the high cheekbones of an Indian, a long upper lip, and enormous deep-set dark golden eyes. In a minute he had dived into the water and swam toward shore. Rosemary and Mrs. McCusco watched him. "He's a good swimmer," Rosemary said. Mrs. McCusco's answer came with surprising violence. "Well, he's a rotten musician." She turned to her husband, who after 2 unsuccessful attempts had managed to climb on the raft. "I was just saying that Abe North may be a good swimmer, but he's a rotten musician." "Yes," agreed McCusco. The woman of the pearls had joined her 2 children in the water, and now Abe North came up under one of them like a volcanic island, raising him on his shoulders. The child yelled with fear and delight, and the woman watched without a smile. "Is that his wife?" Rosemary asked. "No, that's Mrs. Diver. They're not at the hotel." "Have you been abroad before?" "Yes, I went to school in Paris." "Oh. Well, then you probably know that if you want to enjoy yourself here you have to know some real French families. What do these people get out of it?" She pointed toward shore. "They just stick around with each other. Of course, we had letters of introduction and met all the best French artists and writers in Paris. That made it very nice." "I should think so. My husband is finishing his first novel, you see." Rosemary said, "Oh, he is?" She was not thinking anything special, except wondering whether her mother had got to sleep in this heat. "It's on the idea of Ulysses," continued Mrs. McCusco. "Oh, for God's sake, Violet, don't go telling everybody the idea," protested McCusco. "I don't want it to get all around before the book's published." Rosemary swam back to the shore, where she threw her peignoir over her already sore shoulders and lay down again in the sun. Campion walked near her, stood a few feet away, and Rosemary closed her eyes, pretending to be asleep, then she fell really asleep. She awoke to find the beach deserted save for the man in the jockey cap, who was folding a last umbrella. He walked nearer and said, "I was going to wake you before I left. It's not good to get to burn right away." "Thank you." Rosemary looked down at her crimson legs. Heavens! He looked at her, and for a moment she lived in the bright blue worlds of his eyes, eagerly and confidently. She laughed cheerfully, inviting him to talk, but Dick Diver was already carrying a tent and a beach umbrella up to a waiting car, so she went into the water. Chapter 2. It was almost 2 when they went into the dining room. 2 waiters brought them luncheon. "I fell in love on the beach," said Rosemary. "Who with?" "First with a whole lot of people who looked nice, then with one man. Did you talk to him? Just a little. Very handsome. With reddish hair. He's married, though it's usually the way. Her mother was her best friend and had put every effort into guiding her, not so rare a thing in the theatrical profession. Unlike other mothers, Mrs. Elsie Spears was not recompensing herself for a defeat of her own. She had been happily married and twice widowed. One of her husbands had been a cavalry officer and one an army doctor, and they both left something to her that she tried to keep for Rosemary. She had made her daughter hard and she had cultivated an idealism in her. "Then you like it here?" she asked. "It might be fun if we knew those people." There were some other people, but they weren't nice. They recognized me. "It seems everybody's seen Daddy's Girl," Mrs. Spears said. "That reminds me, when are you going to see Earl Brady?" "I thought we might go this afternoon if you're rested." "I want you to go alone." "It's only a short way." "All right, Mother." "Let's only stay 3 days, Mother," Rosemary said when they were back in their rooms. "How about the man you fell in love with on the beach?" "I don't love anybody but you, Mother, darling." Her shoulders were too burned to swim with the next day, so she and her mother hired a car and drove along the Riviera, the delta of many rivers. The chauffeur was a guide, and the well-known names Cannes, Nice, Monte Carlo whispered of old kings who came here to dine or die. Most of all, there was the scent of the Russians along the coast, their closed bookshops and grocery stores. 10 years ago, when the season ended in April, the doors of the Orthodox Church were locked, and the sweet champagnes they favored were put away until their return. "We'll be back next season," they said. But they never came back anymore. It was pleasant to drive back to the hotel in the late afternoon, above a sea. Back at the hotel, Rosemary listened to the music, realizing that there was a party somewhere, and she thought of the nice people on the beach. She thought she might meet them in the morning, but they obviously formed a self-sufficient little group closed to a stranger. She decided in any case not to spend her last 2 mornings with the other ones. The matter was solved for her. The Mcoscos were not yet there, and she had scarcely spread her peignoir when 2 men left the group and came down toward her. "Good morning," said Dick Diver. "Look, sunburn or no sunburn, why did you stay away yesterday?" "We worried about you. We wondered if you wouldn't come over this morning." He seemed kind and charming. His voice promised that he would take care of her, and that a little later he would open up whole new worlds for her. He managed the introduction so that her name wasn't mentioned, and then let her know easily that everyone knew who she was but were respecting her private life. Nicole Diver was about 24, Rosemary guessed. Are you here for a long time? Nicole asked. Her voice was low. Suddenly Rosemary let the possibility enter her mind that they might stay another week. Not very long, she answered. We've been abroad a long time. We landed in Sicily in March and we've been slowly working our way north. I got pneumonia making a picture last January and I've been recuperating. Mercy. How did that happen? Well, it was from swimming. One day I happened to have the group and didn't know it, and they were taking a scene where I dove into a canal in Venice. I had to dive and dive and dive all morning. Mother had a doctor right there, but it was no use. I got pneumonia. She changed the subject before they could speak. Do you like it here, this place? They have to like it, said Abe North slowly. They invented it. He turned his noble head slowly so that his eyes rested with tenderness and affection on the two divers. Oh, did you? This is only the second season that the hotel's been open in summer, Nicole explained. We persuaded Goss to keep on a cook and a garden and a chasseur. It paid its way and this year it's doing even better. But you're not in the hotel. We built a house, up at Tarms. The theory is, said Dick, arranging an umbrella over Rosemary's shoulder, that all the northern places, like Davil, were picked out by Russians and English who don't mind the cold, while half of us Americans come from tropical climates. That's why we're beginning to come here. Abe North and Barban, the Frenchman, were talking about Morocco. Barban was a few years younger than Diver or North. He was tall and his body was hard and force was seen in his shoulders and upper arms. At first glance he seemed handsome, but there was a faint disgust always in his face. Rosemary examined their beach things: 4 large umbrellas, a portable bathhouse for dressing, new things that Rosemary had never seen, made after the war, and probably in the hands of the first of purchasers. She had guessed that they were fashionable people, but though her mother had brought her up to believe such people to be drones, she did not feel that way here. She looked in turn at the 3 men. Actors and directors, those were the only men she had ever known, those and college boys, interested only in love at first sight, whom she had met at the Yale last fall. These 3 were different. Barban was less civilized, more skeptical. His manners were formal. Abe North had humor that amused but puzzled her. But Dick Diver, he was all complete there. Silently she admired him. His complexion was reddish, so was his short hair. A light growth of it rolled down his arms and hands. His eyes were of a bright, hard blue. His nose was somewhat pointed and there was never any doubt at whom he was looking or talking. His voice had some faint Irish melody in it, yet she felt hardness in him, self-control and self-discipline, her own virtues. Oh, she chose him, and Nicole, lifting her head, saw her choose him. Toward noon the Mcskos, Mrs. Abrams, Mr. Dumfrey, and Signor Campion came on the beach. Mary North, the very tan young woman whom Rosemary had met the first day on the raft, came in from swimming and said with a smile, "Well, I have felt there were too many people on the beach this summer," Nicole admitted. "Our beach," said Dick, made out of a pebble pile. "The day before you came, the married man, Mcsko, and his wife were having words and she tossed some sand in his face. So he sat on top of her and rubbed her face in the sand." "I wanted Dick to interfere," Nicole said. "I think," said Dick Diver, "that I'll go over and invite them to dinner." "No, you won't," Nicole told him quickly. "I'm not going to have my nose rubbed in the sand. I'm a mean, hard woman," she explained to Rosemary. Rosemary thought she would not like to have Nicole for an enemy. She stood with them as they took sherry and ate crackers. Dick Diver looked at her with cold blue eyes. His kind, strong mouth said thoughtfully, "You're the only girl I've seen for a long time that actually looked like something blooming." In her mother's lap afterward, Rosemary cried and cried. "I love him, Mother. I'm desperately in love with him. I never knew I could feel that way about anybody. And he's married and I like her too. It's just hopeless. Oh, I love him so. I'm curious to meet him." She invited us to dinner Friday. "If you're in love, it ought to make you happy. You ought to laugh." Rosemary looked up and laughed. Her mother always had a great influence on her. Chapter 3. Rosemary went to Monte Carlo nearly as sulkily as it was possible for her to be. She rode up the hill to an old movie studio in process of reconstruction, and stood by the entrance waiting for an answer to the message on her card. After 10 minutes a young man hurried down to the gate. "Come in, Miss Hoyt. Mr. Brady's very anxious to see you." "I'm sorry you were kept waiting, but you know some of these French women are trying to get themselves in." The studio manager opened a small door in the wall of stage building and Rosemary followed him. Presently, he said, "Hey, Earl, Miss Hoyt." They were meeting for the first time. As Brady took her hand, she saw him look her over from head to foot. "I thought you'd be here any day now," Brady said, in a voice with a Cockney accent. "Have a good trip?" "Yes, but we're glad to be going home." "No," he protested. "Stay a while, I want to talk to you. Let me tell you, that was some picture of yours, that Daddy's girl. I saw it in Paris. I wired the coast right away to see if you were signed. What are your plans?" "Mother thought I needed a rest. When I get back we'll probably either sign up with First National or keep on with Famous. Who's we? My mother. She decides business matters. I couldn't do without her. Again he looked her over completely, and, as he did, something in Rosemary went out to him. It was not liking, not at all the admiration she had felt for the man on the beach this morning. It was a click. He desired her and she did not mind surrendering. Yet she knew she would forget him half an hour after she left him like an actor kissed in a picture. "Where are you staying?" Brady asked. "Oh, yes, at Goss's." "Well, my plans are made for this year, too, but my offer still stands. Wait till after this shot and I'll show you around." Walking onto the set he began to talk to a French actor in a low, quiet voice. 5 minutes passed. Brady talked on. Suddenly, he broke off, calling something to the lights and the shooting began. She did not want to see Brady in the mood he was in and she left the studio quietly and made her way for the train. Feeling good after lunch, Nicole Diver went out into her lovely garden. Her face was hard, almost stern. Her once fair hair had darkened, but she was lovelier now at 24 than she had been at 18. She went up the stairs and into the vegetable garden. She walked rather quickly. She liked to be active, though at times she was very quiet. This was because she did not believe in words. She reached a low wall and looked down 700 feet to the Mediterranean Sea. She stood in the ancient hill village of Tarmes. The villa and its grounds were made out of a row of peasant houses on the cliff. 5 small houses had been combined to make their house and 4 were destroyed to make the garden. Presently Dick came up to her. "Nicole," he said, "I forgot to tell you that I invited Mrs. Abrams, the woman with the white hair. I suspected it. It's a shame. I'm going to invite some more people too." "All right," she agreed. He went back into the house and Nicole saw that one of his most characteristic moods was upon him, the excitement that swept everyone up into it. To be included in Dick Diver's world for a while was a remarkable experience. People believed he made an exception for them, recognizing their uniqueness. He won everyone quickly, but at the first doubt in him he evaporated before their eyes. At 8:30 that evening he came out to meet his first guests. Greeting Rosemary and her mother, he waited for them to speak first, as if to allow them the reassurance of their own voices in new surroundings. She and her mother were fascinated by the Villa Diana. "What a beautiful garden!" Mrs. Spears exclaimed. "Nicole's garden," said Dick. "She won't let it alone. She worries about plant diseases all the time." He turned them from the garden to the terrace, where he poured a cocktail, Earl Brady arrived, discovering Rosemary with surprise. His manner was softer than at the studio, and Rosemary, comparing him instantly with Dick Diver, turned toward the latter. In comparison, Earl Brady seemed ill-bred. Once more, though, she felt an electric response to his person. He spoke to the children who were getting up from their outdoor supper. "Hello, Lanier, how about a song? Will you and Topsy sing me a song?" Brother and sister stood side by side without self-consciousness and sang, their voices sweet in the evening air. After the singing stopped, the children stood smiling calmly at their success. Rosemary was thinking that the Villa Diana was the center of the world. At the moment the rest of the guests arrived in a body, the Mckiskos, Mrs. Abrams, Mr. Dumfrey, and Mr. Campion came up to the terrace. Rosemary had a sharp feeling of disappointment. She looked quickly at Dick, as though to ask an explanation of this unhappy choice of guests. But there was nothing unusual in his expression. He greeted his new guests warmly. "I've met you in Paris," Mkisko said to Abe North, who with his wife had arrived on their heels. "In fact, I've met you twice." "Yes, I remember," Abe said. Rosemary stood beside Tommy Barben. He was in a particularly bad mood. He was leaving in the morning. "Going home?" "Home? I have no home. I am going to a war." "What war?" "What war?" "Any war. I suppose there's a war, there always is." "Don't you care what you fight for?" "Not at all, so long as I'm well treated. When I'm not at war, one come to see the divers, because then I know that in a few weeks I'll want to go to war." "You like the divers?" she asked him. "Of course, especially her, but they make me want to go to war." "You're half American," she said, as if that should solve the problem. "Also, I'm half French, and I was educated in England, and since I was 18 I've worn the uniforms of 8 countries. But I am fond of the divers, especially of Nicole." She felt far from him. For a moment now she was beside Dick Diver on the path. For a year she had had money and a certain celebrity and contact with the celebrated. Rosemary was a romantic, but her mother, with the idea of a career for Rosemary, would not tolerate any silly affair. So when she had seen approval of Dick Diver in her mother's face, it meant that he was the real thing. It meant permission to go as far as she could. "I fell in love with you the first time I saw you," she said quietly. He pretended not to have heard, as if the compliment were purely formal. They had been at table half an hour and a change had set in. Now they were only their best selves, and the divers' guests were friendly and interested. Rosemary liked everyone except Mkisko. After he tried breaking into others' dialogues, he devoted his attention entirely to the champagne. Looking at Nicole, Rosemary found her one of the most beautiful people she had ever known. Her face was the face of a saint, a Viking Madonna. She was talking to Abe North. Rosemary knew from Brady that he was a musician who, after a brilliant start, had composed nothing for 7 years. Just for a moment the divers seemed to speak to everyone at the table, assuring them of their friendliness, their affection. The faces turned toward them like the faces of poor children at a Christmas tree. Nicole disappeared, and presently Rosemary noticed that Dick was no longer there. The guests went to the garden or the terrace. Rosemary felt that this was her time to talk to Dick Diver when he reappeared, so she stood, listening to Mkisko quarrel with Barban. "Why do you want to fight the Soviets?" Mkisko said. "The greatest experiment ever made by humanity? It seems to me it would be more heroic to fight on the just side." "How do you find out which it is?" asked Barban dryly. "Why, usually everybody intelligent knows." "Are you a communist?" "I'm a socialist," said Mkisko. "I sympathize with Russia." "Well, I'm a soldier," Barban answered pleasantly. "My business is to kill people. I have fought the communists because they want to take my property from me." Mkisko jumped at the conclusion that Barban was the end product of the old world, and as such, worthless. Feeling ashamed for Mkisko, Rosemary waited for Dick Diver's return. Mrs. Mkisko came hurrying down from the house. She was excited. "My dear," she said, and then addressed Rosemary, "My dear, it's nothing. I really can't say a word." "You're among friends," said Abe. "Well, upstairs I came upon a scene, my dears." Tommy arose and addressed her politely but sharply, "You shouldn't comment on what goes on in this house." Violet breathed loud and hard but did not say anything. Dick came finally and separated Barban and the Mkiskos and discussed literature with Mkisko, thus giving the latter the moment of superiority which he required. Now she was thinking, "I must have some time alone with him." Rosemary was right. Presently he led her from the company on the terrace to the garden toward the seaside wall. They looked out over the Mediterranean. "I was talking to your mother. She told me that how long you both stayed in France depended on you," he said. "On you," Rosemary all but said aloud. "Since things are over here." "Over?" she asked. "Well, this part of the summer is over. Last week Nicole's sister left, tomorrow Tommy Barban leaves, Monday Abe and Mary North are leaving. Maybe we'll have more fun this summer, but this particular fun is over. That's why I gave this party. Nicole and I are going up to Paris to see Abe North off for America. I wonder if you'd like to go with us." "What did Mother say?" She seemed to think it would be fine. She doesn't want to go herself. She wants you to go alone. I haven't seen Paris since I've been grown, said Rosemary. I'd love to see it with you. That's nice of you. Did she imagine that his voice was suddenly metallic? Of course, we've been excited about you from the moment you came on the beach. I wanted to know all of you too, especially you. I told you I fell in love with you the first time I saw you. He tried now to make her want to go back to the house, and it was difficult, and he did not quite want to lose her. You don't know what you want. You go and ask your mother what you want. I think you're the most wonderful person I ever met except my mother. You have romantic eyes, he laughed. The guests got into cars, as the divers stood side by side in the gate. To Rosemary it seemed very hard to drive away and leave them in their house. Again she wondered what Mrs. McCusco had seen in the bathroom.